Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Design Disruptors. Tonight is our last of 3 conversations in celebration of MoMA Design Store's pop-up Design Innovations for Women. I'm Samantha Krupnick and I manage events for MoMA Design Store, and we're just so happy to have so many people here. Thank you for tuning in. Before we get started with tonight's talk, I wanted to let you know a few things. Please use the chat during the talk, ask questions, share observations, or for any technical help. Can everyone find the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from? Myself, Maggie, and Che are on hand from MoMA Retail and will be answering any questions about the pop-up or topics related to it in the chat. We also have Evelyn and Stephen and Howie from MoMA AV to help with any technical questions you might have. We'll do our best to answer questions in the chat, as I mentioned, but we'll also be earmarking a few for the Q&A at the end of the talk. We'll let you know that in the chat directly. Attendee microphones and video are off during the webinar. This talk is being recorded and we'll be posting it to the MoMA Design Store YouTube in the coming days. The program is being transcribed this evening using the automatic captioning software Rev. To view the live transcription, click the closed caption button on the bottom of your screen, then show subtitle. I'm so happy to introduce Alex Glazer, who is one of the buyers who put together the pop-up Design Innovations for Women and our own product manager for personal accessories at MoMA Retail.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm super excited to have everyone here tonight for, as what Samantha mentioned, is our final talk in the Design Disruptors series. Tonight's topic is Design for Sexual Wellness, the rise of sex positivity and new cultural norms. I'm thrilled to have this amazing panel of guests this evening. I'm going to let them do most of the talking, but first I will introduce them. So we have Laura DiCarlo, CEO and founder of her namesake company, Laura DiCarlo, a company that makes, among many things, robotic solutions that are physiologically informed to enhance sexual wellness and experiences. We then have Eva Goicoechea, founder and CEO of MOD, a modern sexual wellness and intimacy company. And last, but certainly not least, I'll go for least, it's fine. We have Liz Seagrin, senior staff writer at Fast Company and writer of the very recently published The Rocket Years, How Your 20s Launch the Rest of Your Life. Welcome, everyone. Hi.
Thank you.
So I thought to get us started, I could give you a brief overview of the Design Innovations for Women project, and then ground it in a bit of history of design at the Museum of Modern Art. So tonight's conversation, as mentioned, was inspired by our current pop-up at the Soho MoMA Design Store, as well as online, Design Innovations for Women. This is a suite of products that celebrates largely women designers seeking to eliminate stigma around the female body and empower women through frank, open, and honest conversations about our body's unique needs. This pop-up is in its final week, so if you're in New York or close to New York, please come visit. We have lots of safety protocols in place and we'd love to have you there. Certainly if you are from far away, as I see most of you are, which is pretty exciting, you can always explore the collection at store.moma.org. So I thought I'd give us a brief history of design, some general thoughts, and taking a look at how the museum's exhibition history gives us a bit of context for the conversation this evening. So we have the next slide, please. So MoMA was the first museum to have a curatorial department dedicated to architecture and design. As far back as the 1930s, visitors to the museum were challenged to consider design as being as important to our cultural heritage as more traditional art forms like painting and sculpture. So as we developed this suite of products, we looked to MoMA's design exhibition history for inspiration. On this first slide here, you see an exhibition called Machine Art, This was put on just 5 years after the museum's founding by 3 women, founded the museum, gotta get that out there. And it invited visitors to take a look at objects, machine-made objects like ball bearings and pots and pans and scientific instruments displayed on pedestals like you might typically see a sculpture and consider them as an object of art as well as design. The next slide shows us a more recent exhibition called Humble Masterpieces. This expanded upon the precedents set by machine art by exhibiting around 120 different simple objects, things like Post-it notes, paper clips, Band-Aids, big pens. These really small, often in size as well as price, modest, indispensable masterpieces of design, things that you see every day and don't really realize because they're so well designed and part of your everyday life. And then most recently, we have the 2017 exhibition, Items as Fashion Modern. This explored 111 different items of clothing as well as accessories that have had a strong impact on the world in the 20th and 21st century, looking at the things that we put on our bodies as holding important cultural currency. So among these designs featured were things like a burkini, the bikini, the wonder bra, a lot of things that addressed the needs that women's bodies had and what we could do to support them. So throughout the decades, MoMA has been very active in bringing new design concepts to the public, concepts and ideas that surprise people and expand our thinking on what good design is and what role it plays in our lives. In this tradition, we really hope that design innovations for women, as well as tonight's talk, can serve as a platform to facilitate the ever-changing conversation on the value of good design for all. Okay, I'm done with my little lesson. Let's get into the talk. I thought a really great way to start it off, we've had amazing conversations with all of us before, but what I find so interesting is you're such different backgrounds and how they brought you to where you are today. I think our guests would love to hear, the different things that maybe they were intentional, maybe they were certain choices, certain obstacles or coincidences that really led you to where you are. So, Laura, if you could get us started and maybe give us a little bit of background on what brought you to found your company. You're muted. Should we? Oh no.
Unmute.
Oh, you're there.
That's very weird. As soon as you took it off the share screen, everything disappeared for me. So can you hear me, see me?
We can do both. I can at least.
I'm just gonna go off feel then. So I have over a decade of experience in healthcare, and after an honorable discharge from the US Navy, I actually enrolled in a pre-med program only to pivot into entrepreneurship, because after having this life-altering orgasm that literally landed me on my back on the cold tile floor after I shuddered off the side of the bed, and I had one leg hitched up on top of the bed, just thinking, oh my gosh, how do I do that again? And how do I do it again by myself? Because that was powerful. And I thought, I wanted to recreate that experience on my own. And as kind of a self-described anatomy geek, I actually became really fascinated with the psychological, physiological, and anatomical aspects of the female orgasm. So I conducted my own research, gathering anatomical measurements from hundreds of women, and I discovered, and people with vaginas, and I discovered that one common factor among them that stood out was that every single person I talked to had the same problem and a desire for a solution to this orgasm paradox that I did. The two biggest problems that were stifling that solution was a lack of accurate data to inform an effective design, and shame, lots of shame. So I began designing my first data-driven product rooted in robotics and physiology, and I founded the company, Laura to Carlo, in October of 2017, and here we are today.
Thank you, Laura. Eva, do you mind giving us a bit of your background?
Sure. So I actually have had two chapters in my career. One was in healthcare. I was a legislative aide in California. After studying marketing, which is another story, but I went back to California from New York and was exposed to really what like the consumer relationship was with their health and how sometimes it was really inaccessible. I then went back into marketing. I moved to Los Angeles and I worked with a lot of amazing brands and was finding that these other industries were being bettered by design and bettered by access to community, but sexual wellness just wasn't. And it seemed to be as stigmatized as ever and looked the same as it had for 100 years. I was one of the first employees at Everlane, which really informed how to build a startup. I was number 7 or 8. And then in 2015, I started working on Mod. And really, we're a company that is designed to create these really accessible basics through design for all ages and all genders. And for me, it's a really big deal to include all ages, because I think the industry has not only been hyper sexist, but it's just really ignored anybody over 25. So I'm proud to have a company that is inclusive in that way. And we launched in April of 2018.
Thank you, Eva. You've brought up a number of points that I'd like to get to after we let Liz introduce herself and give us a bit of her background on what led her to where she is today.
Well, thank you so much for telling your stories about the journeys you took. It's something I'm very interested in. It's actually, a big part of the book that I just wrote called The Rocket Years, How Your 20s Launched the Rest of Your Life. And everything that I do now as a journalist and as a writer is deeply informed by the PhD that I got before all of this happened. I received a PhD from UC Berkeley in classical Indian love poetry with a specific emphasis on women, gender, and sexuality. And I think that there was one key insight that came through in the research that I did that has really informed how I think about sexuality now in all of the different writing that I do. And it comes from the philosopher Michel Foucault, who talked about how while sex itself is a biological act that hasn't really changed over time, when we look at history, it's so clear that cultures have totally different understandings of sexuality and have created entirely different ways of approaching relationships between people. And that in turn informs how people experience and enjoy sex. And so to me, that was such a powerful insight. The research that I was looking at revealed that women in early India, so from the 3rd century, had a very different approach to sexuality than women in India today. They were very expressive about their sexuality. They were very concerned about their own pleasure in the sexual experience. And these are not things that we see in current literature, in current, Indian culture for the most part. And so to me, the insight that I got from that is that we can design the culture around sexuality. Humans can construct and design the culture around sexuality. And so whatever we're experiencing now, the way that sexuality is constructed in our current culture, that can be redesigned. And we have a role to play in redesigning that. And so we can do that, as a culture, which is what I try and do in my journalism, but it's also what we can do in our own lives. And that's why I'm so passionate about this topic and in my book, which is that we can also kind of shape the way that we approach sexuality in our own lives. These are not fixed things, and these are things that can be shaped. And so this is the powerful idea that has driven a lot of my passion towards this issue, and I'm sure it's going to come up again because it's an important framework for me. So yeah, that's my circuitous background to what I do today.
Thank you all so much. Every time I hear you talk about your experiences, I'm inspired even more. And I think you all sort of talked about and around a certain same subject about shame, which Laura mentioned, or taboo, or the idea that these things, are shunned away and pushed aside and really shown to be sort of dangerous or bad or anything like that. And so I wanted to talk a bit about both taboo and censorship, because I think they play a really important role in design decisions. Eva, one thing you had mentioned was that ultimately the sexual wellness industry and the entire industry was really founded on censorship. So I thought maybe you could discuss that a little bit and then talk to us about how you've been able to approach that and maybe combat that with your design decisions.
Yeah, so actually what's been really interesting in this journey is learning that I'm in Brooklyn, which is the home of where censorship for this category, in particular the condom industry, started. So in about 1873, Anthony Comstock, who was an advocate for, he basically was, you know, the police for all things moral and immoral, which we're facing the same kinds of issues now. He passed the Comstock laws, and it essentially made anything obscene illegal. And before that, there had been a lot of, you could buy condoms, you could buy prophylactics and items in this category in a lot of places. And what ended up happening because of that was actually great design. Because what people figured out was that they could, if they circumvented the, you know, if they were going about it in a way that they didn't have to say the word contraception, and if they could create beautiful packaging that made you think it was something else, that they could continue to trade. And so that's what was happening. And mod was really inspired by that time of creating beautiful things that were for sex. And it wasn't until 1937, when the FDA started regulating condoms, that big players who could go through the FDA process started taking over. And so this industry has always had these really interesting points in which design is dictated by what's happening at like a federal level, what's happening with policy and laws, and then also what's happening with, you know, our socio-political movements. So in the case of, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, it was all around contraception and family planning, and then later on it went to be around protection from STIs and AIDS. So all of that has informed the design of the category, and I think by constantly connecting it back to these really taboo topics or these really stigmatized topics, we've created an industry that looks, you know, very much like this taboo thing still. And so I have been so interested in the history of condoms and of really what you found at the drugstore, and am trying to really recreate that narrative and do something with design in order to destigmatize and normalize it for people. And here we are 100 and some years later, and we still haven't gotten there. So it's a pretty interesting history, but it was completely censored is the point of that story.
Thank you for the history lesson. And I think it's true when you see your packaging that it allows it to, you know, be behind you and be innocuous, but also beautiful at the same time and sort of normalized within the context of the space. Laura, I'd love if you could discuss, I think that there are many people who are attending tonight who may know already your sort of infamous story of censorship regarding the OSE, but I thought maybe you could discuss a little bit about your experiences there. And then also something that was brought up by you before was how censorship and an experience like that can either restrict change, but also force change to happen.
Absolutely. So I kind of wanted to start this off with a little bit of a history lesson, because long before we founded Laura Carlo, I think we all know this is a historically male-dominated market that found its tech origin with Dr. Mortimer Granville in the late 1880s. He invented the electric vibrator and originally called it a percussor, which was actually manufactured and sold to physicians, many of whom actually used the equipment to create hysterical paroxysm, which is just a fancy name for orgasm. And they used that to treat their patients that had female hysteria. The more you know. So 140 years of vibrators in the world is ready for a change, and it shows. There's a small outcropping of companies that are gaining momentum due to the rise in popularity and growing awareness of women, like companies like Mod and Laura Carlo, in designs that are for women and people with vaginas by people with vaginas. And women and people with vaginas are reclaiming that pleasure and their sexual health and wellness. And we're finally seeing a shift, the tiniest shift away from shame and censorship, but we have a long way to go. And in fact, the e-commerce is actually a perfect microcosm of how society responds to the very idea of female sexual empowerment. We censor it, we dismiss it, we look the other way, or we look right at it and we call it slutty. So we aim to change that. So shortly after founding my company, we engaged with Oregon State University to develop our first product, Ose. And months later, we had this prototype and 5 patents. So we applied for an Honorary Innovation Award in robotics at the Consumer Electronics Show. It's the biggest tech show in the world. And our tiny women-led team of 6 applied, and we actually won. And we celebrated. We thought the tides are turning for people with vaginas in technology and women in technology, and the taboo around sexuality is dissolving, or so we thought. And because about a month later, they told us they were taking our award away. They called our invention profane, immoral, obscene, and that's really interesting because I think of, and we think of, female and all sexuality as being sacred. So we implored them to reconsider. We pointed out the decades of gender bias, the booth babes. There was actually VR porn for men exhibiting at the show, on the show floor. And the fact that there wasn't a single female keynote speaker in 2017 or 2018, not one. And they still refused to give us back our award. So we launched this international awareness campaign on the very first day of the CES show in 2019. And we completely just avalanche over any of their coverage. And we got this overwhelming amount of support, and we garnered and completely changed the trajectory of not only our company, but it changed the trajectory for a lot of folks that are in this space, period. And we discovered something about ourselves. We found our purpose throughout this process. And that purpose is to empower people of all genders to explore and educate, love, and accept themselves, not just themselves, but others as well. And that provides people with the confidence to create a more equitable world. So what we did was we actually turned around. CES came to us, the CTA came to us and said, can we talk? And we realized they wanted to give our award back. So we said, let's do one better. Let's provide a safe space for all people in sex tech to be able to show at your show. And let's do it in a really respectful, tastefully done manner. If it's tech that really is innovative, it's solving problems, and it's not objectifying or demoralizing human bodies, then it should be at the show. So in 2020, this year, we haven't been around that long. In 2020, we actually saw a show that was completely reinvigorated, and we had 12 different companies there, many of whom are, our competitors, but we were happy to have them there because we realized that all ships rise with the tide. And this conversation around human sexuality and around how people identify, we know that's directly related to sexuality, and that deserves to be out in the open. So we felt like it was a win-win.
Thank you, Laura. You brought up a handful of topics that I think are really important to this conversation, important to the conversation in general, which is about inclusivity and accessibility of design. And certainly that's something that we think about a lot when we interact with the world. But I think about, for example, I posted that I was doing this talk tonight, and I got really nice feedback, which was great, but I also got a handful of things like, I have a penis, is this for me? And cheeky things like that. And I think it's interesting to consider that and Liz, I kind of like to get your opinion about this, but how do we open this conversation up to more people? Because certainly the people on this panel are very confident about what they have to say, but not all people are. So how do we open up the conversation so that we're not just preaching to the choir?
I think that this is something that I had to deal with myself as I was going through my PhD, and during that period I was also teaching classes full of undergrads where we were raising these topics, and so I got to see firsthand the way that we bring ourselves to a culture of sexuality and sometimes self-censor. So I think all of these conversations that we're having about censorship that's external, I think a more insidious version of that is that it is tied to the way that we think about sexuality in our own lives, and then begin to, restrict what we feel like we can talk about, and perhaps more profoundly, like who we think we can be and what we can experience and what is normal. I do think that the reason that censorship and taboos are so powerful is that they're often tied to some sort of notion of truth or some sort of ideology, right? And that's why all of these taboos and all of this censorship is so powerful, because people believe that there is a good reason that, women's sexuality should not be equivalent, like women's pleasure is not as valuable as men's, right? Or that or that sex is somehow shameful. These are grounded in ideologies that exist around us, right? And I'm not saying that those ideologies are valid or true, but they're there. And I think that the one way to begin unpacking that is to just identify what is the cause of that taboo and that censorship. That's the first step, I think, to beginning to unpack it. I think that we need to do this at a societal and cultural level, which is, I think, what a lot of what you're doing with your products and normalizing this and sort of rejecting mainstream ideologies about what is normal, what is okay, what is good, what is healthy, what is considered part of wellness, right? That's what you're trying to do with your products. But I also think that at an individual level, what we should be doing is we should be trying to identify what these taboos are and unpacking them and breaking them down. And so that means, for instance, things like, so much of the culture of repression of sexuality is grounded in religion. That's just part of what is true, right? In all of this, it's not just Christianity. The literature that I was looking at was from the 3rd century, and in the 7th to the 12th century, it completely fell out of public circulation in India. And we think that that's because Hinduism became a more dominant force there. And suddenly, all of that literature was censored. And so culture changed, right? But I think the same is true for Christianity. And so I think it's really valuable for us to reconsider, what is going on, right? That is causing us to censor ourselves and create these taboos. And often, I also spent a lot of time looking at the Bible when I was getting my PhD. And when you actually look at different traditions of interpreting the biblical texts, there are so many celebrations of female sexuality in the Bible, right? There are ways of interacting and having conversations, even among the people who are creating these taboos and pushing back against them using their own texts. Because the truth is that, sexuality, we've been wrestling with this and talking about this for a long time. And there are many ways that we can sort of begin to unpack these taboos. But I really think that the way to make this, to answer your question, to make this more inclusive, I think we need to try and figure out what is preventing people from being part of the discussion and identifying those things, and then beginning these open conversations that unpack these things that are causing us to feel shame. And once we get to that point, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, the culture around sexuality changes how we experience sexuality, right? So I think that once we get to that point, I think that people can have a completely different, sex without shame is completely different from sex that is engulfed in shame, right? And so just making that shift is life-changing. And so I think that that's the solution.
Thank you so much, Liz. Also, I think of this question as thought starters, and you have amazing thoughts. So I'm happy to hear everything you have to say. Eva, I would love to talk to you a bit when we talk about inclusivity and design, because your brand and your ethos is really about democratization of the sex or sort of sexual wellness democratization. And I would love if you could speak to that a bit more and what you see the value in that being.
Well, as Liz was talking, I was thinking not only was I nodding my head because I was agreeing so much with it, but I was thinking about the fact that, you know, sex has sort of been, we consider, when you talk about sexual wellness, often people start to think about other things like, are you talking about porn? Are you talking, it's this umbrella term that can be appropriated in all of these ways. And there's not a lot of diversity shown within the industry to say there's everything from maybe a mod, which is sexual wellness and intimacy, where we try to create these, like I said, everyday basics, all the way to maybe porn at the other end of the spectrum. All important things in some way, but really there's a lack of diversity in terms of how we talk about sex and what we're seeing in design and in product companies. And so I think that has really affected, and again, you look at, we all face monopolized industries. I mean, in Laura's case, if it's in the device and toy industry, there are certain players that have kind of owned the category for a long time. It's the same thing on the drugstore aisle. And so that has determined how we interact with, this is great, how we interact with these products. So I think design is going to be the thing that does democratize when we start to see more diversity of design and thought and representation of different preferences and genders and age. I think that's when it will start to completely change the whole industry. And so we're only, you know, there's only a few companies that have started to crop up, but I think it's going to take a lot more. And then just at the very basic level, including basic sex education and having conversations. You're right, Liz, like this, it's culture, and it comes down to what's happening at the dinner table and what's happening amongst partners and friends in terms of conversation. But I think it requires seeing it out in the world in a different way. I will say what's interesting, and Maud tries to tap into this through our content, is like, we're all okay with romance and we're all okay with intimacy, and we all watch the same stupid rom-coms, guilty, right? But we somehow have separated that. Yeah, somehow we've separated and compartmentalized sex and intimacy and love and all of these things, and they all are very interconnected.
Hear, hear. It also brings up, you had mentioned once, you know, we compartmentalize as well the places you can access this stuff. So there's, you know, you buy your vibrator perhaps at like, you know, something like the pleasure chest, and then you buy your condoms in a different place. So we've compartmentalized the industry, which makes it harder to have access to it. I would love, you know, I think there's a lot to discuss in the sort of inclusivity category. And one thing in particular is the idea of gender. Certainly we're discussing design innovations for women. And from the outside, I think that can be a very sort of narrow perspective. And I'd love to hear, this is sort of to anybody who'd like to answer, but the idea of how gender can play a role in the design of your products and who you think your designs are for.
I'd love to kick that off because we actually have, it's actually part of our founding blocks as a company. We believe that sexuality informs identity, and that when we're secure in the identity, in our identities, that actually builds confidence. And that confidence is what empowers us to go out and change the world for the better, each in our own way. So as a company, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, like how do you design for folks that have different parts, or how do you design for folks that, you know, are trans or identify as women? And we decided to take that a little bit of a kind of a level higher. And we use data-driven solutions by gathering information from all demographics and all walks of life. And we integrate that with our own innovative and elegant technology in order to provide solutions to some of the world's biggest problems that all kinds of people face with sexual health and wellness. Keep in mind, we are still very young. We just launched this year, but we do have a long product roadmap that is extremely data focused. We focused on the experiential and the journey, not particularly on the gender or the parts that you have, but the sensations that you might crave, or the experience that you actually want to live. We have folks on staff that are from all walks of life, that identify as trans, male, female, young folks, and much older. And we do regular studies on and involve as many different kinds of humans as we possibly can, because we realize that I can't innovate all of this inside of a bubble. We need to understand, what does the consumer need? What do they want? What are the biggest problems? So we've involved thousands of people in these studies, and we've also involved experts in this space, sexual psychologists, medical doctors, and have them help us put these studies together in order to ask the right questions so that we can get to the heart of the matter. And at the end of the day, we're not looking to innovate or create products that are made for penises or vaginas or men or women. We want to create experiences for humans.
Thank you, Laura. We don't have a ton of time left before we get to Q&As, and there's a handful of topics I'd love to kind of get to. Something has kind of come up is the idea of education around sex, because certainly we all come to this with a bit of education of our own, whether that came from schools or self-discovery, whether that be with yourself or searching on the internet. But I'd be curious to hear, maybe Eva, you could field this one, how you think that design can fill the gap between the education we're given and the great wide world that's out there and worth discovering.
Well, so we talked a little bit about this offline, which was like one of the things that we wanted to sort of bring back was the Buttercup Condom, because 13 states require medically accurate sex education, and a little under half require sex education at all. And a Buttercup Condom, you'll know which way is up, and about 25% of people misuse a condom. They'll unroll it again, and these are small things in terms of how to use the product that we think about when we make them. Again, they're very democratized solutions, and they're small changes, but they do end up making a difference in terms of your level of comfort with using them and or talking about them. And what we were hearing from people was that the design informed how uncomfortable or comfortable they felt with the product, and then that trickled over to how people educate about sex, whether that's in the classroom or, again, at the dinner table. And we wanted to create products that kind of look like the rest of your personal care, and were very, very easy to leave out, or very easy to sort of own for the rest of your adult life. And while I don't think that mod alone can solve for the sex education issue, I do think that by being, by creating products like Laura's creating, by creating products like Mod is creating, and allowing for people to make those decisions without the stigma, it lends itself to larger conversations and a bigger cultural shift, and that eventually trickles down to sex ed. So in our case, side note, I'm on the board of an organization called Peer Health Exchange, which and they bring peer-to-peer health education for sexual health, mental health, and substance abuse into the classroom where there is typically none. And by us partnering with them and us really advocating, and them being able to feel comfortable signing up to work with a company like ours, it's allowing for there to be a more honest, accurate conversation. So design really does matter, especially in this category.
Thank you. And Liz, do you think, sort of on that, because I think that Eva is getting to the same point, but can the design itself educate? So can it be a tool for education as well as opening up avenues for conversation and all of those other things?
Yeah, I think it definitely can. I know that, in a lot of the work that I do, I'm looking at how products of all kinds are designed. And I often write about the world of fashion, which is so interesting because so many of the products that women consume were originally designed by men, right? And so one example that I wrote about, recently was the high heel. I was really interested in exploring the history of the high heel, and you know, true to form, you know, it was a man who invented the first high heel, and he was he created it in such a way that he thought would accentuate women's bodies and make them as alluring as possible to men, right? And so, you know, and there's a story that I recently wrote. And so I do think that, you know, with the high heel, for instance, as an example, there's been a wave of women who have entered the market and tried to rethink the high heel, for instance. And this is just an example that we are going to slowly bring back to sexual products. But the point is that, you know, in rethinking the design, women themselves began to learn more about what the high heel actually does, you know, what its origins were, how it can affect your body. There have been, you know, when I was working on this story, I talked to several women who began their careers as podiatrists and eventually turned to designing high heels because they realized that actually high heels are really terrible for women's bodies, particularly the way that they had been originally designed. And that there are things about the heel that can be altered to improve, you know, to improve the way that, you know, the body aligns and to be healthier. So really just like, you know, talking about the design process really opens up a lot, you know, a lot of new insights about the product itself, right? And, you know, as Laura was saying before, I mean, a lot of the tools that we you know, use for our sexual health, right? Whether that's sexual or reproductive. I mean, these were also things that were invented by men, right? Like the tampon, right? These, like a lot of these products that you know, go into women's bodies, right? These are products that were designed by men who will never have to use them and not have to deal with any of the consequences of, you know, these products, which, like, for instance, with the tampon, are, now we know, full of toxic chemicals, right? I mean, so there's a lot that goes into the design process that just by unpacking it, we learn about how it's impacting us. But as a journalist, the question that I raise is, you know, design tends to be very incremental, right? Like we see what is in reality, we see products around us, and then we iterate on them, we modify them, we try and make them better. But that doesn't fundamentally sometimes like undermine, you know, or force us to reimagine the product itself. And so this is a question that I pose to designers. I mean, I think it's a hard problem because, you know, we are trying to improve the world around us, and the world around us consists of objects that we live with, right? And so improving them incrementally is definitely, you know, bringing the world forward and creating progress. But how do we get to a point where we don't even start with the male created object as the starting point, and we like rethink sexuality, you know, at its core? Like, is that something that we can do? Is that even possible? I mean, you know, I just think that that's a fascinating question, and that's something that we should all be trying to wrestle with.
Thank you, Liz. And then one more before we go over to the Q&As from the audience. But Laura, you had really amazing thoughts, and I think it would be great because you were explaining how design can also educate you about yourself. And I think it's kind of a nice way to close it out.
Man, this mute button today. Yeah, so we'll make this anecdotal. So I had this orgasm, and being the weirdly obsessive student that I was, I went into research mode only to find that, surprise, no data was actually to be found. So in this very grassroots manner, I started collecting that data on my own. So I was literally asking folks, hey, where's your clitoris? Can you find your glans clitoris for me? Can you tell me about your clitoro-urethral vaginal zone? And they just kind of look at me like, what? And you'd be surprised that nearly every one of them responded actually in the same way, in 3 stages. First, they were embarrassed and ashamed, and then they got really curious and engaged because no one ever talks with them about this really taboo topic. And then secondly, I realized nearly none of them were really properly familiar with their own anatomy. So I had to actually teach and walk people through, you know, their pleasure zones and their pleasure points. I ended up actually having to draw diagrams and talk people through this. And then I discovered that there really was a problem to be solved, and this huge colossal gap in the market for a physiologically informed, technologically advanced sex tech product. So part of what makes our products and our brand different is that we aim to educate folks using these experiential tools. And I've found that folks that actually use these products know more about what's going on with their body. When you're more in tune with your own body, you actually touch yourself, you actually understand what's going on. It is a confidence builder. You do understand more about your own body. You can be a better patient advocate for yourself when you sit down and talk with your doctor. You do understand more what it means to have bodily autonomy and you know, what that means. But I've discovered there's a huge divide between people that find it to be totally taboo and people that, you know, have actually taken the time to get to know their own bodies. They're bigger advocates. They're actually more involved on a plethora of different levels, not just, you know, where their own pleasure is concerned, which I think is really interesting.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you all. So we're going to move in some questions from the audience. I've been kind of watching the chat. It's amazing. Everyone has the best things to say. I'm like, you should all be moderators, and I'll leave this room right now. So we'll get to some. Hopefully we'll get to most. But starting off, this is a great question. So I was hoping the panelists, meaning you guys, could talk a bit about the taboo of intimacy with objects over humans and where that's going. Is that mostly an American thing? Do you think something like COVID-19 will shatter that taboo? Or do you think that there will be a backlash? Will the future bring technology that people will feel true intimacy with? So there's a lot in that question. Feel free to kind of pick and choose. I think, you know, the COVID-19 thing is certainly an easy reference point since we're all dealing with it now, but feel free if you guys have a thought.
I'll go ahead and jump in,
Yeah.
because like I said, we did that study with over 1,500 people,
Right.
and asked them point blank, why do you masturbate? And we found that the top 3 reasons that people explore their pleasure is because they want to sleep better. They want to lower their stress levels. And they're in this pursuit of an overall better sense of well-being. So this year, post-COVID, we conducted another study finding that indeed people were masturbating at an exceeding rate very early on at the beginning of the pandemic. But then as folks became more stressed out about jobs, sickness, civil rights movement, politics, and the general state of absolute disarray that everybody's experiencing, that pursuit of pleasure actually really dropped off. And I'll let everybody else kind of talk to this because I've said enough, but I'm telling you, get back on that horse. Orgasms are proven to help improve better mental and physical well-being. That's all.
I mean, I also think that there has been a, you know, as I was doing research for the book, so there are many different parts of the way that I think about these things, but when I was looking at, you know, the worlds of 20-somethings, a lot of them expressed, before COVID, expressed a lack of intimacy in a lot of their relationships. So I think that there has been people have been struggling with this idea of intimacy, particularly because of things like online dating and how do we reconfigure intimacy as it's mediated through technology, right? Like as people are forming relationships with people who may be further apart from them, or, you know, or the early stages of a relationship are happening, you know, in a way that's mediated through technology. People have been struggling to try and make sense of how intimacy works in those contexts. And this is a brave new world, right? Like online dating, all of these technologies, they're 20 years old, less than that, right? And so we've been trying to figure out how sex and intimacy really should work in this new world. And we're working through that. And I'm actually encouraged by the data that I'm seeing and the anecdotal stories that I'm hearing about COVID, because it's forcing people to be a lot more creative, I think, about how they think about intimacy and pleasure and sexuality. That's not so monolithic. It's not just about a hookup, right? I mean, there are many ways that we can deepen our intimacy with one another. And it's not just through porn necessarily, right? There are many ways that we can do this, right? And so I actually think that, as weird as it is, I mean, I think that just kind of forcing us to think beyond what we had been thinking about before and pushing some of those boundaries is probably a good thing, because this is a brave new world of trying to create relationships, like mediated through technology and with these new ways of interacting with people. And I do think that, like objects, right? Like I don't know if that's really what the question asker was asking, but things like vibrators and objects that are part of the sexual experience, if there were taboos about that in the past, I mean, hopefully this is beginning to unwind them, and that maybe they can also be used not as a replacement for a partner, but like in relationship, right? In new ways. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and when you have someone like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Eva.
Oh no, I was just going to say that we have seen, all of our content once COVID hit sort of started to discuss really what Liz is saying, which is like navigating relationships and intimacy, whether you're stuck in with your partner or you are single and you're trying to date or you're trying to connect. And we just found that the amount of people reading our content went up so much during COVID, and still is, because I think people are looking for intimacy. I mean, I'm glad that word keeps getting brought up because it's so connected to sex. And before that, we're sort of all running through our lives and we didn't really have the time to pause and think about intimacy in general, amongst other things. I mean, we're all now cooking at home and but yeah, we definitely have seen that on our side.
If I can add, I also think a lot about for example, the New York State guidelines that came out about how to have safe sex during COVID, and to see someone like Governor Cuomo say things about rimming, for example, certainly normalized the conversation in a really public way that I think have allowed, they talked about fetishes, they talked about, doing things with the camera, but it suddenly normalized like typically taboo conversations about sex into a really public sphere, and not only calling it normal, but safe. And I think that really changed the conversation a lot, and hopefully for the better. So I'm going back to moderating. We have another question here, which is, how can we democratize products and information in third world countries, for example, like Colombia?
I mean, I think the exciting thing is, as countries are adopting more online commerce through COVID, you're starting to see that access happen. I know for us, what makes it a challenge, just to throw that out there, is that we're dealing with class 2 medical devices. So we can't always be in other countries. We have to deal with the government of each of those regions. And so, but I do think that what's great, and it sounds like Laura has the same customer feedback loop, is that we're able to see where our customers are coming from, where their demand is. And, we now know like how we can successfully launch in these other places and give access, because we know that the demand is there. So it's great to be online. It's great to have that relationship with the customer. You can be in every corner of the world, and we get messages like this all the time. So our hope is that we are eventually in Colombia, and that we are in other places beyond just the United States and Canada. But luckily, the relationship has already started in terms of.
But I do think that, if I can add a point there, when we're having the conversation about inclusivity, the one thing that came to mind is that so many of the products that we're talking about and the conversations that we're having are happening in pretty progressive communities, even here in the United States. And I think that one challenge is that, in so many parts of the world, and my area of specialty was India, in order for people to feel comfortable even accessing the website of a company like yours, there has to be a way of talking to people that makes them feel safe, and like this, that this fits into some sort of ideology that they can get around, right? And so I don't necessarily mean like pandering to a religious ideology or anything like that, but basically just kind of speaking language that they get. And so I really think that perhaps one of the next frontiers of inclusivity, I mean, there's so many of these frontiers, and I'm so happy and so proud that you guys are tackling them in terms of, like people with queer identities and trans communities and things like that. Those are definitely very important, and we should be tackling that. But I do think that at some point, the next level of inclusivity should involve people who currently don't feel like they can be part of this discussion because they feel so ashamed because of whatever, their religious community or, or what they were raised with, right? And I think that involves much more of this kind of cultural, it goes beyond just kind of like designing the physical product and marketing it to people who already sort of get what you're trying to provide to them, but sort of like making the argument to people who may not naturally come to you in the first place.
Well, so anyone can tell you who knows me that I wouldn't have been the person to start a sex company. But yeah.
You didn't go to school for that?
I mean, no, right? I went to Catholic school, so here we are. But I think in terms of that's exactly our audience, actually. What we have found and what we always wanted to achieve was that we were going into places that were typically underserved in terms of geography and age groups. And so Maud has a very strict stance in terms of our voice about being hyper explicit. We think there are plenty of companies that are hyper explicit, and that's, we're trying to really get into places that would normally not feel comfortable for people, and have conversations that are a little bit more about the culture of sex and really attitudes towards sex and intimacy again. So that's actually exactly what we stand for. And it's been really interesting on the conversation on innovation, because it's very much emotional innovation. It's very much cultural innovation. We don't lead with product innovation as much as like Laura does. We're not a sex tech company. We're really an intimacy company. So that's why we exist. That's the whole point. So I hope that we make a difference.
That's so exciting. Yeah, it's great to see you expand into other markets as well.
Me too.
So, and just to add on one, I think, like I said, we're a very young company. We're still very new. But we do have an approach to our e-commerce strategy is very much think global, act local. So we actually have several teams that are all over the world that do just that. They create content that is culturally and regionally appropriate to be able to speak to those that are in that space. We're now in over 19 countries and continually looking to expand, but we want to do it in a way that is holistic and organic, and it does take local folks into consideration and local traditions into consideration. And then on top of that, where it makes it difficult for folks to be able to pick up these products and try them out or even talk about this, we've created a really safe space through the website, and we actually have product pros and coaches. You don't have to buy a product at Laura to Carlo to actually get into one of these workshops or into one of these like one-on-ones with one of our coaches. If you just want to talk about product, if you're interested in product, if you have questions about what might be right for you, or if you just want to talk to folks. We actually had a workshop the other day where we had somebody who was 21 years old, queer femme-facing person, and a woman who was like 65 plus, from completely different countries, completely different walks of life, and they just sat there and just like jammed for quite a while. It was kind of neat to see. But trying to do as much as we can to bring people together and realize that like sex is actually the one common, like the commonality that we all have. So it's kind of interesting to see people come together in that space.
Thank you. So we are at 9:01. I'd love if you guys are willing to stay for one last question, and whoever is a participant and listening in, you're welcome to continue to listen to us talk. But I would love to know, and we also got this question from the audience, what you feel like the future of this space is and what you feel like the future of sexual wellness is. And maybe we could get something from each of you. So Liz, if you want to start.
Yeah, I would. So I'm so happy to be with these product designers because I don't design products, and I just spend a lot of time thinking about them. And so I can like give you my wish list, and then you can go take care of this. So I hope that you do.
The best part, just being an ideas person. Ugh.
Yeah, it's like way easier for me than it is for you guys to actually execute. But one thing that I have been thinking a lot about is the culture of pornography, which I think really informs so much of, you know, sexuality, the culture of sexuality in our world today. And you know, historically there have been, you know, feminist porn collectives that have created, you know, pornography that sort of abides by their ideologies of sexuality, but it's generally been targeted at women. And I really think that one thing that could be amazing would be for progressive organizations or founders to create you know, a culture of pornography that is actually healthier, maybe, and that in which, you know, women have a bigger role as you know, founders and as you know, participants, and you know, and you know, and actresses and so on, right? But where all of that is bringing men in, right? Because I think that for us to sort of rethink sexuality in our culture, it needs to be a conversation that both men and women are part of. And so far, it seems like the only way that we've dealt with this question of porn is that, you know, women have created porn that seems to be largely targeted at you know, at women who share their values. That I'm beginning to see, you know, as a writer, like organizations that are popping up with you know, really cool like audio erotica that is just like the last couple of weeks, an organization called Campsite and another company called Ann Jane launched with this kind of content that's for everyone, and it's trying to rethink the world of pornography. But that's like something that I would really love to see more of, things that really involve men in the conversation about sexuality.
Well, also, you literally like hit every like everything, because I think I get that question a lot where folks are like,
this off the list now.
Say it again.
Oh, I can just take this off the list now because you're going to handle it, right?
Right. No, I love that you said that, because I don't think we say it enough that, you know, very, very seldom do I get this now, but some people are like, are you an angry feminist? Like, no, we have, like, my company is made up of probably 60% female facing or female identifying folks. And we have a whole lot of allies and advocates that are male facing in this company. We can't do it without them. So I love that you said that. But I guess to be really succinct about like where we want to see this going, and I could talk about tech, I could talk about porn, I could talk about products, I could talk about conversations all day long, but really we want to see a sexually equitable world where individuality is celebrated and sexual exploration is praised instead of demonized, because that's where we are right now.
I can just say in terms of product, like we are seeing that especially our brand is starting to sort of get perceived as sitting at the intersection of personal care and beauty. And the way that people treat their beauty routines and the way that they treat their personal care routines is what they've come to expect from our company. And I feel like that is the future, is that people will start to be able to feel like they're free to respect their sexual wellness as much as the rest of their wellness. And you know, hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later.
Definitely want to see sex tech and femtech just very firmly seated within sexual health and wellness, within the health and wellness category. And I don't think I said this earlier, CES actually asked us if we allow sex tech at the show, at this huge international show, can it have its own category? And I said, absolutely not. And they wanted to know why. And I said, because sexual health and wellness is health and wellness. It belongs in that category. And the moment you try to put us in a corner, you continue that stigma. You put us out on the main show floor with the rest of health and wellness. People are going to walk by, they're going to go, look, there's sleep tech. Look, there's fit tech. Oh, look, there's sex tech. And oh my gosh, there's sex tech.
But I think you brought up such a good point. Like there are statistics that are having sex and having intimate relationships increases like your lifespan. It's the equivalent of making $50,000 more a year. It's what really like Yeah, it's true. Like really what binds us together.
I'm on the floor with one leg shaking. Yeah.
And I think that, you know, I've sat in rooms where I've asked people, 50 people, do you ever talk to your gynecologist about a vibrator? And the answer is no. And so it's going to really, I know there was a question here around healthcare, but I think it's in every facet of this conversation, we're going to need to start talking about it in a much more healthy and normalized way. And I think that will contribute to the change. So
Here,
it's
here.
good for your health.
It sure is. I am so sad to say we have to wrap up. This has been an amazing conversation. I thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. I thank everybody who tuned in. I don't think we had like anybody drop off throughout the conversation, so I think we all could have sat here for another 3 hours. But everyone, please have a good evening. I'll give one last plug to Design Innovations for Women at MoMA Design Store, and kudos to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.